Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk in depth about the process that I use to flatten out this tabletop that I'm using for my heavy bench. I've made a 3-video series about actually making this bench top, and you can check out the link in the description below to see those videos. But today I wanted to focus more in depth on flattening out this tabletop. So I laminated pine boards, and you can see the glue lines, the glue run out or squeeze out, and you can see right there some boards that protrude above the surface. The table is relatively flat, and I glued it up on this laminated bench bottom that I had made previously, and the two beams that everything rests on are flat and in plane with each other. And so everything's relatively flat, but there are some high spots like those protruding boards that need to be taken down. And so everything's been glued up. The next step is to flatten the top. And flattening and prepping the top for finish is a two-part process. Part one is to power plane or use a planer to take off the high spots. And then part two will be to sand the tabletop. And I want to talk in depth about that. We're going to be using 3 tools to do those 2 things. Tool number 1, of course, will be the power planer. And here I'm using an old Ryobi power planer that I have that has 2 3¼ inch knives. It's a very effective tool. I'll also be using a belt sander and then an orbital sander. So the 2 tasks are to plane the top and then to sand the top. To plane it, I'm using the power planer. To sand it, I'm using 2 sanders. One is a belt sander, which I find to be very effective on sanding large surfaces like this. And then the second sander that I'll use is an orbital sander. I want to talk in depth about each of those tools or each of those processes. So let's start by talking about power planing. So power planing is a primary stock removal step used to flatten a surface and remove significant high spots or uneven material on large boards or panels. And the goal when we power plane is not a perfectly smooth finish at this stage, but rather a consistent flat surface with minimal major variation before we sand. And so one of the fears that people have in using a power planer is they might gouge too much out, or they might mar the surface more than they could recover from. And really, if you're setting the power planer up properly, you should not encounter that, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the key points before we talk about that, we're going to use a power planer to remove any protruding sections. In this case, with a laminated top, we're talking about protruding boards, and then glue squeeze out, and then any cupping from one edge of the table to the other edge. So for example, the front to the back, there might be a slight cut because those boards toward the edges might have lifted or something. We want to keep the planer base flat against the tabletop, and any kind of tilting that we do will cause gouging from the blade corners or the knives. And then you want to start with a minimal knife protrusion and adjust until the knives are just cutting. So I'm going to set my planer to the shallowest depth of protrusion on the knives, and probably whenever I make a pass it won't cut anything, or it will barely cut. And then I'm going to turn the knob and make it protrude a little bit more. And when I do that, I'm going to get to a point where I have a knife protrusion that will actually cut material. And once I start doing that, I can then back off and go back towards 0 protrusion, which means that I'm always working with a little bit more finesse as I go through this process. And that way you ensure against gouging and cutting too deep. So again, we're going to start with minimal knife protrusion, and we're going to adjust until the knives are just cutting, And as you remove the high spots, you're going to back the depth of the knives off gradually so that you aren't cutting too deep once the surface flattens. And if you're following that procedure, you should never be going too deep with the power planer. It should be a relatively straightforward process where you're minimizing the amount of material you're taking off each time. Common issues when you're planing include surface gouges from incorrect tool angle or edge dig in, and that will happen occasionally. Just back off the depth and hold the planer flat. Uneven removal can leave ridges or valleys if the planer isn't controlled consistently. And then you can have cord snags. That's something that may not seem too obvious or intuitive, but if your cord snags, it'll create more jerky movement in your workflow, and you'll end up with gouges and unevenness. Another thing with the cord is you can end up, if you're not careful, cutting through your cord if it ends up underneath your planer when you pull back. That said, I'm typically keeping my planer down on the board whenever I'm working it. And again, if your planer knives are set shallow enough, you don't experience kickback. Another thing is you can overplane. You can remove too much material before you sand. And so again, I think keeping in mind to keep backing off the knife depth as you move further along. And therefore you're removing less and less material as you go. The solutions to those problems: number one, maintain safety and control. Keep your power cords behind you, but be sure they have enough slack so that they don't catch either under the planer or on the edge of the table. Keep the base flat, and again, that's relative to the overall surface of the table. Consistently seat the planer on the tabletop, and you can prevent edge gouging. And that may be a little bit hard at the very beginning when you're working a high spot, but as you work that high spot out, you should be able to seat the planer on the tabletop relative to its flatness. Focus on the high spots first. So you're going to visualize the obvious humps and bumps like they're small hills, and you're going to start at the highest point and then work outward to flatten. And you're broadening your strokes as you move out. And then again, progressively adjust the knife depth. Begin with a shallow cut that barely removes material, then increase until you are cutting material, and then fine tune it back down as the surface becomes flatter. Then we move on to belt sanding. Belt sanding, and a belt sander is a power tool with a continuous abrasive belt. That's excellent for rapid material removal and flattening large surfaces before fine sanding. It's typically used after power planing, and the power planing has left a roughly flattened surface. I think more people fear the power planer than they do the belt sander, but I honestly believe if the power planer is set properly and you're progressively cutting less material and readjusting the knives, I think your belt sander can do more damage to the table because there's nothing to stop it from gouging more and more and more. Whereas the planer has the infeed plate and the outfeed plate. We're going to use on this belt sander medium grip belts typically. On woodworking, we're not using 40 and 60 grip belts. I'm going to be using 80 to 120 typically. For initial sanding, the belt sander is efficient at smoothing out planer marks and flattening glue lines. I want to hold the tool flat, and I want to move evenly over the surface, and you do not want to stop or linger in one spot, and you also don't want to use excessive down pressure. One of the things I love about the Porter Cable belt sander that I'm using here is that it has a lot of mass and weight. Some other belt sanders that I've used in the past are very light, and that makes them harder to control. Some issues that you'll experience with belt sanders are you'll have, too much wood removed because it's so aggressive, and it's real easy to take off too much material. You can also leave kind of burn marks or unintended dips if the sander stalls or is held in one place. You can have uneven scratch patterns that need follow-up sanding, and if you don't keep the tool level, you can lose flatness across the tabletop surface. So to solve all of that, we want to use controlled passes. You don't want to rush. You do want to keep moving. Let the belt sander remove material at a steady, even pace. And then your grip and stance is important. Maintain a firm hold and stance so the tool doesn't tip or unevenly pressure across the surface. And I want to use both hands on the belt sander. I want to progress through the grit levels. After major sanding with the coarse belt of 80, I'm going to move to the finer belt of 120. And with the 80 grit sandpaper, I'm typically removing just the scars left from the planer. Then we move on to orbital sanding, and the orbital sander's purpose is to remove the scratches that are left by the belt sander. Orbital sanding is the final smoothing stage, and we're using a sander, of course, that moves in a circular or random pattern or both to remove sanding marks left by the belt sander and refine the surface before finishing. And the task here is to produce a surface that's ready for stain or sealer. We're going to again choose the appropriate grit. And typically I'm going to use the same grit to start with on the orbital sander that I finished with on the belt sander. So on this table I'm using 120, and then I only went up to 220 on this table. For surfaces with pronounced grain patterns, occasionally you might need to step back to a coarser orbital grit. In other words, maybe I would have finished my belt sander with the 120. Maybe I need to go back to an 80 grit on the orbital. And that'll help remove any cross grain scratches, like if you had a walnut claro type pattern, or where the grain swirls, you might end up with cross grain scratches that you didn't intend or that you couldn't help. Some of the problems with random orbital sanding include swirl marks. If the sander is held stationary, or the pad is worn, or if the pad is clogged, or if the pad has a grit that's protruding too much, you'll end up with swirls all through your wood surface. And those are very visible, especially after staining. All of us have probably seen stained furniture that had swirl patterns, and it really dulls the finish because you can't see the grain as well. Another thing is uneven sanding if excessive pressure is applied or the tool isn't kept flat. The pressure and flatness on these tools is very important. So again, holding them flat against the surface of the table relative to the surface of the table is so important. And also not pressuring the tool, just allowing the sander to do the work. You'll have solutions to those problems if we would keep moving and stay flat. Again, replacing discs when they're worn, or if they get clogged with something like some glue, or maybe there's some sap that you run across. Well, that'll clog your sanding disc and it'll leave the swirls. We want to progress grit carefully, and we want to inspect with lighting. So good lighting and checking our work against light will help us determine or detect the swirls. Just some general notes on sanding, and then we'll finish up. Number one, again, we want to sand progressively through grits. If you skip grits, that often leaves the deeper scratches that finer grits won't fully remove. So don't progress from an 80 grit to a 220 grit. Go ahead and do the 120 grit in between those. Sand with the grain where possible to minimize scratching. The scratching will be visible in the final finish if we don't do that. And again, there may be times where the grain swirls and you end up crossing the grain. And just use your orbital sander to remove those scratches or to minimize them. Power tools can save time, but they must be used skillfully. Uncontrolled sanding can ruin a surface faster than it improves it. And so that's very critical. Anyway, well, thanks for watching. I hope you've gained something from this video. I finished a few table surfaces this way and really enjoy using power tools where I'm unable to run this tabletop, for example, through a large format belt sander or something like that. So the power tools work effectively, and it's just a matter of overcoming the fear of using them and then using them properly when we overcome that fear. Well, again, thanks for watching. I hope it was a benefit to you. Leave a comment below. Be sure to give me a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Thanks.